Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Optimizing Mobile Application Testing, Reduce Costs and Release Faster, featuring Wim Sellis, Staff Product Manager Mobile here at Sauce Labs. My name is Ashwini Sathe. I'm a Senior Group Product Marketing Manager with Sauce. It's now my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Wim Sellis, who's currently serving as a Staff Product Manager Mobile at Sauce Labs. He has over 12 years track record in automation engineering, and his history with Sauce really dates back to 2018, beginning as a senior solutions architect. A longtime APM advocate, he's well versed in helping customers navigate the maze of automation issues. And intrigued by mobile space, Wim regularly undertakes his own technical investigations and even codes his own apps, aiming to fully grasp the challenges developers encounter. So with that, I'll pass over the mic to Wim to get us started here. Go for it, Wim.
Okay, thanks, Ashwini. And everybody, first of all, thanks for taking the time to listen to me. It's going to be a long ride today, so hope you're buckled up and we're ready to go. Reduce cost and release faster. That's basically the question that we're trying to answer during this webinar, and we're going to do that by covering a few subjects. And the subjects that we're going to cover today are the mobile test strategy, how it can help you reduce your cost and release faster. I'm going to look into infrastructure and choices that you can make when we're talking also about infrastructure. We're going to look into device coverage, and not specifically only for real devices, but basically for emulators, simulators, and real devices, which configurations can help you. And in the end, we also have a Q&A. If you have questions during the presentation, feel free to also enter them in the Q&A box, and we will try to answer them at the end. And if not, we will make sure that we try to answer that in a follow-up email. But I first want to start with want to understand also everybody who's here and the knowledge that everybody has regarding testing. So hopefully you can start at the first poll that we have, Ashwini, because I'd love to also understand how many years of experience everybody has when we're talking about mobile application testing specifically. If you have 0 to 2 years, 2 to 5 years, or 5+, and like Ashwini already mentioned at the beginning, I'm in testing since 2007 already, and I think I have a lot of experience for testing. Started really diving into the mobile space around 2013, so for me that's at least 5+ years. But I'm also curious for you how long you've been testing mobile applications. So hope we would see the numbers. Oh, we got a mixed audience here. I see here around 40% with 0 to 2 years of experience, 20% between 2 and 5, and 41% also with 5+. So we've got a mixed audience here. Hopefully the things that I'm going to share with you are not specifically new, but might help you rethink what you're doing right now. And if it's new, try to write it down, or at least try to use this also when you're back at your job, when you need to think about testing your mobile application itself. So let's first start with the first point, what I wanted to look into. Let's first start with the SDLC, because I also believe that when you start for mobile application testing, you also have a lot of knowledge about testing for web applications. And what I first want to do today is I first want to compare basically some gaps that there are between testing something for the web and also testing something for a mobile application. And a mobile application could be your web application, it could be a hybrid application or a native application. And I want to compare that with a web application based on the software development lifecycle. I think everybody knows this one, where we would have planning and coding, building, testing, deploying, and then also when it is in production, trying to monitor this. So let's first start with the first phase, like planning and code. Just compare that web and hybrid/native applications with each other. And if we would do that, then we would see that it doesn't really matter. There's not a lot of difference here. Depends just which technology you're going to use. But if you need to fix a bug, or if you need to add a new feature, or if you just create a complete new application, I think we can compare that with each other. So planning and coding at the moment wouldn't be a huge gap there. If we're talking about building and having almost the average application for web and for native applications, then you would see that building a web application is pretty fast. If you look at a very complex application with a lot of dependencies, then this might be a little bit slower, but normally building itself on your local machine or in your pipeline is pretty fast. If you would compare that with native applications or hybrid applications, then you would see that it's a little bit slower. You might need to build 2 applications for Android and iOS. And yes, you can do that in parallel, but still you need to build 2 applications. And yeah, kind of like getting the right assets, getting the right output might take almost double the time of a web application. Just keep this in the back of your mind. Then testing. Testing itself for a web application is pretty fast. And then we're focusing on the UI. I'm not talking about unit test cases. No, I'm trying to compare UI test cases here. And the advantage, for example, for the web is that you can manipulate your state. So you can easily jump from screen A to C without going through a login screen, for example. You can easily manipulate it. That's not something you could do with, for example, native applications. Unless you're using, as we call that, native frameworks. You can use Espresso or XUI test, and you've got more access to the internal code. But normally, if we compare Selenium and Appium with each other, then web is way faster than also automating native applications. Having said that, let's also take a look at the deploy. And I think we would see a gap here, a gap which is pretty big. And also something just to keep in the back of your mind. Because if we're going to release our web application, we could, if we have everything in place, we can even do that daily, hourly, or even by minute if you just have small increments that you're deploying to production. But if we look at native applications, then we're basically depending on the grace of Apple and of Google. If they allow us to release the application to the store, they're going to look into this, they're going to review it, and this might take between 1 and 7 days. And yeah, if you're unlucky, it's 7 days, meaning if you have a new app or if you have a new feature, it's not out there in production. And if it's out there, if you are able to release it, it still can take up to 24 hours for your application to be shown in every store. So this is already a huge gap we need to be aware of when we're thinking about testing, when we're thinking about the things that we need to look at, responsibilities, and also some risk. If we release something to production which has a bug, it will take us some more time for our mobile application in comparison to our web application to roll that back. Well, basically, there is no rollback. You can only roll back your web application. You just need to release a new version for your mobile application. And then again, you've got that 1 to 7 days. Hopefully it will be faster. Keep that in the back of your mind. Last but not least, we also have kind of like, if it's in production, how are you able to track down what was happening if your end user has an issue? For the web, you can easily spin up a virtual environment with a Windows machine or with a Linux machine or a Mac machine and just install the browser that you need to have and debug it there. You've got a lot of traces, stack traces already in your application that you could debug. Try to do that with a phone that's in the hand of your end user. Try to get that information. If you don't do this at the right point in time, that you add basically some traceability there, then you would have a big challenge to replicate what your customer is facing. This is also very important to keep in the back of your mind. But if we're also here to talk about a testing strategy, what we already see here is that the bottleneck in this complete process is testing. Testing itself for web, but especially for mobile applications, is already a big challenge here. So what I want to do is, based on this, I want to go back to the basics. And now imagine that you are on a new assignment. You need to test an Android or an iOS application. It could be a new application, completely new. It could be an existing application, but there's basically nothing. You need to start everything. You need to start with a strategy. There's no infrastructure. You might already have kind of like your laptop, might be a Mac, might be a Linux or a Windows machine that could help you do some testing, but that's the only thing that you have. So what would you do then? How would you approach this? What I would normally advise for people is to use this, the WWW technique. And then I'm not talking about using Google, because it's not the World Wide Web that I want to push you to. I'm also not trying to push you here to ChatGPT. This is kind of like the thing that we see a lot. A lot of people, if they don't know what to do, they just ask ChatGPT. That's not what I mean with WWW. What I mean with that is that we're going to use basically the most powerful instrument we have as a tester, basically our brains. trying to think logical. What do we need to test? That's that's already one thing, one part of that WW, the what. 3 questions. And it doesn't matter which order you ask yourself these questions, but before you start walking through your application manually or doing this with automation, first ask yourself, okay, what should I test? Why should I test it? Why is it really important? Why am I even working at this company, for example? Why is not only for my own money, my company also has some objectives and some goals. And also a question, for example, where should I test it? Let's start with the what should I test? And you can put all kinds of questions here. But if we talk about a new application, if you want to know what you should test, you can already start reading documentation, talk to marketing department, designers, product owners. They've been talking to different customers. They can give you a good idea about what is important and what needs to be tested. If you have an existing app, you can do exactly the same as with a new application. But you can also ask questions like, how did it start? What was the first version that you released of your application? How did your application evolve? How did the features evolve? It can give you a good understanding about the movement of your application, but maybe also the demands of your customers. And what's also really important is reading reviews of your application. If you have an existing application, try to read what's being posted also on the stores. And I think this is something that a lot of humans do. We always think about the bad. We never post a lot about the good, unless you're on Instagram. But on those stores, we only post stuff that's bad. So you would see a lot of negative feedback. Try to read through it, but try to detect if there's a pattern. Because there might be a pattern that certain customers are facing the same challenges. Those reviews can be really useful if you're able to read through all the negative comments and find that pattern. If you're new to testing, so if you basically don't know what you need to do, so if you just started your testing job and if you just started to automate or to manually test a mobile application, my advice would to go, for example, to Ministry of Testing community. You've got tons of information about where to start with testing. But you can also go to conferences. We also have our own podcast that you could listen to. A lot of awesome subjects are being discussed there that could help you learn more about what you need to do and how, and specifically what you can test. Now let's go to the second, the why. Why should I test it? And I think this is really important, that you also try to understand with the application that's being developed, which problems we're trying to solve with it. And also, what's the business risk if we go to production, if we have an issue, what's kind of like the worst thing that could happen to us that would bring us in the news? Because that's something that you don't want, because 9 out of 10 times it will not be good news, it will be bad news. You want to prevent this. Always ask yourself this question. If you need to test something, why should I test it? What's the real reason? And then last but not least, also something we need to think about is, where should I test it? And for people that are in testing for a few years, they also know that the testing pyramid or the testing trophy is something that is used a lot. But what I also really like, and this is a link, we will share this link also afterwards with you, is a presentation that Richard Bradshaw from the Ministry of Testing gave a few years ago during SOSCON. I think it was 2019, where he talked about pyramids are ancient. Let's talk about an automation strategy. Because what he was seeing is that, one, a lot of people, if they were doing some manual testing or automated testing, they were focusing mainly on the UI and trying to test everything in the UI. They didn't really have a strategy, and that strategy, if they had it, it was the testing pyramid, but then turned upside down. Like normally with the testing pyramid, you would have your unit test, integration test, UI test. It was the other way around, small portion of unit test, but a lot through the UI. And because I really liked what he was presenting there, I wanted to also share that with you, just to help you think about how to test it, what to test, and also where to test it. So if you would just look at a simple login flow, if you have your mobile application and you need to test a mobile, your login flow itself, then you can already divide your application into multiple layers. And you've got your UI layer, then you've got your app code, then you've got your API layer, you might have a database layer, and maybe 10 layers below that. But this is kind of like a very high overview of how you can basically cut up your application. And if you would then look into that login flow, then you would have different steps but also different checkpoints that you could think about, which you need to test. For example, if you open your app, then what do we need to do? We need to render a form. That will all be determined in the app layer. Then you would see it in your UI. You interact with it. In the end, it will send an API request with the data. It will be processed. It will get a token. Basically, this is how a basic flow would look like for a login flow. What we see a lot is that a lot of people try to test this, basically all those steps, just through the UI. By dividing this into layers, then you would have basically the input to think about what is really important in this specific layer. Do I need to test all my error states through the UI? Because we've already seen in the first slides of the SDLC that testing is a bottleneck, especially when we talk about the UI. Should we maybe move this more to unit test codes? Or do we need to move something more to the right? And then again, think about the question, what's the business risk if I'm not testing it now, but if I would test it on a different level, how would it help me? And how would it also speed up my testing process and release faster? So now that we're already talking about the UI, let's dive a little bit more into the mobile part itself. Because when we're talking about mobile phones, we're talking about something that's in your hand or what's in the hand of your end users. So let's talk a little bit more about a mobile testing strategy. And why do we want to look into a mobile testing strategy specifically? Well, it has to do with the fact that testing for mobile devices it's pretty complex. It doesn't only need to cover your UI aspects, but also need to look into hardware, network conditions. You might have layout issues. You might have device incompatibility, OS issues, network issues, all kinds of challenges that your end user might have when he's using his phone outside in the desert or whatsoever. Just think about those scenarios. Those are the reasons why we really need to think about mobile testing strategy. So one of the things that I also love to use is the mobile testing pyramid. The mobile testing pyramid has been created by Quoting. He's a good friend of mine. I worked with him for a very long time, and I will also explain a little bit more about that in a few slides. But he created the mobile testing pyramid just based on his testing pyramid. The normal testing pyramid doesn't really quite cover the detail that is needed for basically your mobile testing strategy. You can see kind of like the testing pyramid as a metaphor that will tell us to group software test cases into buckets of different granularity, but that's basically it. If we look into the mobile testing pyramid, then it will also give us some guidelines and some tools on what to test where. Can we divide this also, getting back to the presentation of Richard Bradshaw, can we divide it into layers? Which responsibility does every layer has? You can already see here that we have a browser layer if you're testing a mobile web application, or if you're testing a hybrid application, which also has a browser layer. Or do we need to really test this on real devices? You already see a remark here in the presentation about non-functionals are just as important as functionals. Exactly. Those are really important things to understand. How does my application perform on the device? You can always test it on the latest iPhone. Hopefully tonight they will release the iPhone 15. But yeah, you'll still have users that are using, for example, the iPhone, 8 or maybe an SE, which is not that fast, but still your application needs to function there. So non-functionals are also very important. If you want to watch the original talk, we also share that link with you later on. Really interesting just to see how he explains this. From a SaaS Labs perspective, we used basically what Quo was explaining in the mobile testing pyramid, and we added a few steps to it. Let's also take a look at that. And then hopefully I can also explain you a little bit more about what you need to test where. So like we mentioned, you start with your desktop and browser layer. If you have a web application, this will be the first layer. If you have an hybrid application, then the web part of that can be already tested in that desktop layer. And think about that you're going to use resized browsers when you change also the user agent. Tell the user agent what type of browser you are, because some style sheets might change differently based on, oh, I'm an iPhone, I'm an iPad, and you're going to resize it. This is not for testing, for example, the layout. This is more for testing, will it scale properly? Is it what I'm expecting? And just walk through your functional flow. You can do this very fast. You can spin up a lot of browsers, and it will already give you a good feeling if this is working, yes or no. Advice here is not to only test this on Chrome on a resized browser, but try to use that mix. If you have an iPhone, then you can also use a Safari browser. And then on a Mac machine, just resize it and use that just to validate if your functional flows are just working, yes or no. It can give you a good idea if it's working, so you can pass also to the next level. And the next level that we would advise you to use here are the virtual devices, basically the Android emulators and the iOS simulators. Main focus point of this layer, if you're used to, if you already tested on the desktop layer, the main use case then here would be to think about usability. And what I mean with usability is testing it with your fingers. Your end user is using their fingers on a phone. They're not using some kind of JavaScript injection to scroll. Then it will always work. No, try to focus here on gestures. How is your user using your application? Those are the things that you can do here. If this is the first layer that you're starting with because you need to test a native application, then you can also do your functional flow here. Also, start with some usability testing. The main focus here is already how is your user, your end user, using your application. One thing I wanted to mention, or two things basically, the virtual devices can scale pretty easy. You can run a lot of test cases on a huge amount of the same configuration. It's pretty easy here to spin up 50 simulators of an iOS iPhone 11 with iOS 16.2 on it, for example. It's pretty hard to do that on real devices. So if you need to parallelize a lot of stuff, virtual devices are really useful. The second remark I wanted to make here is for the Android emulators. I think we as SaaS Lab, if I may say so, and I'm also responsible for that as a product manager also for the mobile part, we kind of like trick you, fool you by also sharing that we have Samsung emulators. To be honest, there is no Samsung, UI, Xiaomi, or whatever brand-specific Android emulator. There's only one version. Basically, you've got those specific Android versions, but there's only one type of emulator that you would have. It's stock Android. And that stock Android can be configured. You can configure it with CPU, you can configure it with memory, but also screen sizes. And when you see Samsung device, then that means that we resized it to a equal, but not Android version equal, but on a screen size equal emulator. Just keep that in the back of your mind, because this is also the part, if you need to test on certain devices, if you have challenges or issues with devices in production, like for example a Samsung, then the advice would be to test this on real devices, because it could be related to the OS flavors, all the things that they add on top of the OS. So, and that also brings me back to the third layer, which is the real device layer. In that real device layer, you're basically testing the how do you say it, the things that the leftovers from the previous layers, because we're not going to test what we did on the desktop browsers. We're not going to test that on the virtual devices and also on the real devices. No, if you want to release fast, and if you also want to think about some costs, then every time you go a layer up, you would test less, / you would focus on the real things that are important. Like for example, validating the UI. A real device is a real good place to validate how your UI looks and feels. Because I've never seen an end user of an application use a virtual device using your application. No, they use a real application, a real device. What you would also see here is that there's an end user added to the top pyramid. And what we mean with that, this is also the layer where you could use, for example, beta testing, where you can get more feedback from production, or you can use and you can get more feedback pre-production. Before you release your apps to the store, you can think about having a beta program where people will give you feedback on how your application is responding. If they like it, yes or no, give you feedback about the flow. Maybe you thought, or your company thought about an awesome flow and nobody's using that flow. Could be End users can give you that feedback before you go to production or afterwards. You can even interact with your end users through, for example, a beta program or through the beta SDK. If you look at this and also would divide that into steps, you would also see that basically the development, the more you go to production, the more kind of like chance you go to the real devices. And it's basically also the same with the personas. The developers would mainly focus or on the desktop browsers or would focus on the virtual devices. There would be kind of like more of a mixture between QAs and also your end users / your extended teams or your product owners to use also the real devices. The mobile testing pyramid presentation from Coding, or also the presentation from this webinar that I gave, will help you to think about that mobile testing strategy to determine what is really important. What should I test it? What should I test and where should I test it? And again, testing everything on the desktop browsers for a web application that also needs to work on a mobile device might not be the right area. But I'm not telling you that you need to test everything from the desktop browser on a mobile device. Try to think on what your user is doing on that device. What are the specifics? What makes it unique on that device? Try to test it there. So if we go back, try to answer the question based on this mobile testing strategy. How will this help you reduce cost and also release faster? Like I already mentioned, if you know what you need to test, if you know basically what the right value or the business impact is, you know where to focus on. This will help you already release fast because you're basically removing the redundant test cases that might not have real added value. And just if you need to choose between two test cases, just two simple examples. You would have a log info, you have a retail application. Let's use that. You have a retail application and you're going to sell jeans. And what would be more important? Being able to do the complete checkout where you earn the money, or if you need to test a feature to change your username. And I think if we would then think about business impact, what's the most important thing to test? That would be the checkout. That's the part where you earn money. That doesn't mean that we don't need to check that, change your username, but maybe we can put that in a different layer because it's not something you always want to test on a real device. You can divide that process into steps, into layers. And then you might say, okay, maybe I can just cover this with a UI test and then I'm done. Or with an API test and then I'm done. Or maybe with a unit test and then I'm done. So try to think about those steps. This will help you reduce your cost and give also faster feedback, meaning have the opportunity to also release faster. So now that we have a better understanding also about testing the what, the why, and the where, I also want to look into where are we going to execute this? So let's start with the environment. And again, going back to the initial, I started with the story, you're new, you started with your own laptop, there's nothing else that you have. What's kind of like the first thing that you need to do? Or what's the first thing that you want to do? Where do you want to execute your test cases? Well, wrong slide. Sorry for that. Let's go back. Yes. And, oh yeah, sorry. It is the right slide, my bad. If we go back to that software development lifecycle and also think about testing itself, then again, we're in this spot. But now imagine that you need to test it. You've got a new pull request. You need to test it. Maybe you're kind of like the bottleneck here. Maybe you just need to test this in different phases. If your machine was ready to run that mobile test case, how are you going to give your machine to every phase here in this software development lifecycle? If you're running a test case on your local machine, then you would see that if you execute your tests, you're not able to do anything on your machine. The only thing you could do when you're at the office is just get coffee for everybody, but doing that every hour because your colleagues are building something every hour, that doesn't scale. So we need to also think about our environment and being able to shift it more to the left. On the other hand, we also have that shifting right, where we need to think about that deploy, about the operating feedback. We need to think about how can we test that. That is not specifically connected to testing it on your machine, but maybe you want to test it in the real world, thinking about beta testing. So now that we know this, let's think about what you would do. Again, you have your laptop. What would you do? And if there are a lot of people here that love to automate, then I think I already know what you're thinking. And to be honest, I've done this also 7 years ago together with Quo. And for the people who never done this, what I mean is build your own grid. This was the most exciting part of my job when I started together with Quo when we were working at a large bank in the Netherlands. It was so awesome to do this, basically building our own grid. But again, I don't want to make you enthusiastic about this. Let's first ask you a question, because I'm curious if you've also done this, yes or no. If you ever implemented an on-premise testing infrastructure. So hopefully, Ashwini, you can pull up the poll. I'm assuming everybody will see the poll. Yeah, there it is. Love to kind of understand what you've done. Vicky, just from my experience, what I've done in the past, I've built a Selenium grid that used desktop browsers. Then second step was I added emulators and simulators to it. And the third step was that we added real devices to it. And to be honest, I learned a lot out of that. Everything I know today is based on what I learned at that time. But I'm just curious also what your experiences are. So let's see. Cool. We've got 52% who never built this. We've got 18% who built this for real devices. For virtual devices, 6% and 24% that built this for both. Cool. I think then the following steps will be interesting for a lot of people who never had this experience. Because I believe that you might be as enthusiastic as I am. Or I'm just kind of like an odd person. That could also be the case. But I was really enthusiastic when I was able to do this together with Quo. So what I'm going to share with you now is what we've done. We've written this down, and this link will also be shared. Sorry for you guys, it's in Dutch. But we wrote an article about our experiences for a Java magazine, a really large one in the Netherlands, which was called NL Jog. But all the experiences we had then were written down. I'm going to share that also with you. Building your own environment to run your test case on. Oh, if I could do it again, awesome. First thing that you start with, basically just hardware. If you build your own and then focused also on mobile devices, you need to have a few Mac Minis. Why? Well, Apple. All automation for Apple, interaction with Apple devices needs to be done through Mac Minis. Yes, there are some solutions out there that you can run with Linux, but they're not, I wouldn't say they're not that stable, but they've got some challenges. When we started this journey, there was nothing for Linux. We need to have good cables. Really important. Like the default cables were not as stable as norm as you would expect. Also, powered hubs, we needed to have an extra developer license because, yeah, we had the developers had their own license. Every iOS application needs to be signed with a signature from Apple. And we also needed to buy Android and iOS devices. How we determined which device we need to buy is something we're going to cover in a few minutes. But this is the basics. So we were working at a bank. We got a credit card. We went to the electronics store and just bought basically the list that you see here. Then we needed to start building something. We need to have software. So we used the Selenium grid, and we also used Appium. And now imagine that the Selenium grid you would have now is easier than we had by then. But this was already a challenge, but we were able to achieve this. But then we also got some additional work because, yeah, when you build your framework and you're running a test case, you also want to get some logs. And by default, you don't get them. You don't get the video. You don't get the report. Some additional work was also needed to think about cleaning. If I executed my test, the build will still be on the phone. On an emulator or simulator, you just destroy the emulator and simulator and you spin up a completely clean image. That's not what you can do with real devices. And then also imagine if a phone is 24/7 on power with that powered hub that you bought, you also need to reboot it. You need to kind of like say, okay, I will give you some time to breathe. So we needed to build that also. And then last but not least, when we were busy with this, we had more and more challenges. tests are being blocked, for example, because Apple or Google told us, hey, there's a new iOS version. For example, tonight you will get a notification, hey, iOS 17 is there, please download it. It will block your automation. One thing, and this is also something that you will see in the article, batteries got swollen. Or we even had a screen, kind of like the glue of the iPhone 5 screen. It wasn't there anymore. We could just lift up the screen. It was funny to see what happened inside, but you can just lift it off. Things are going to happen with your devices. We needed to buy new devices. Devices were getting offline. Think about the challenges that you would have. It's weekend, but you still have your pipeline, or it's evening, you still have your pipeline. Who is going to bring your devices back to life when it's broken? We needed new devices. How do we do that? How do we procure new devices? Oh yeah, and with the limited set of devices that we have, how do we make sure that we have the right mixture of specific OS versions, for example? So there were some challenges, some additional work, but the new challenges, they were growing and growing. This is just based on my experience, but I'm also curious what your experience is. If you've built this, I wonder what your biggest challenge was. And you're able to select multiple options here. Like I mentioned, for me, the biggest challenge was keeping the device in the clean state. For me, that it was like everything is becoming new. Every new version, you will get new APIs from Google, the new restrictions, new notification, permission models. We all need to think about this. Those were the biggest challenges for us to solve. But curious also what, if you've been doing this, what your biggest challenges were. So wondering what the outcome is. In the meantime, I will take some water. Okay, procuring and distributing is 30%. Oh, this is a nice way of calculating in the poll. That's the advantage of combining everything. But kind of like the thing that I see here, ensuring sufficient test coverage, that's also something that we're going to cover, and maintenance and operational cost of the on-prem infrastructure. That's correct. I want to dive more into that one, into the maintenance and operational cost of the on-prem infrastructure, because if I now look back, then it was an iceberg that we were busy with. And then I'm not talking about the Titanic, that we were hitting that iceberg and that we're going down. No, but you can use this iceberg that you're only busy with the top of your iceberg. If you would talk to procurement or the people who are responsible for the financial, for the numbers, the only thing that they see are the things on paper that you've bought, basically the hardware costs. And to give you some more information, the things that we bought, where we started with, and in the end it grew, but where we started with was 2 Mac Minis. We bought the cables, we had 2 power USB hubs, and we used 6 iOS devices and 6 Android devices. How we selected them, basically how we determined that coverage, is something that we're going to cover, and that will also kind of like get back to one of the answers that people selected. But this is the part that a lot of people see. We don't see what's under the water. We normally don't see that. We don't see the overhead. We don't see the hidden costs. Just a few examples here. These are things that will slow you down. These are things that would cost you extra money, because you need to have a dedicated person, especially for mobile devices, understanding what's happening on iOS, what's happening on Android. How can we fix it? How can we clean it? Oh, it's changed in iOS 13, but it's if we now look at 14, they changed it again, and now they changed it again on 15 and 16, and it goes on and on and on. Really, really hard to solve this. But even, and this is kind of like the bottom of the iceberg, something that people are not thinking about is this. If you're not testing your application properly, what are the costs of the poor customer experience? If you're blocking yourself with your own grid, you're not able to test it because the devices are down. So, well, then let's just take the risk and go to production. What do you think about your developer experience? Not specifically the developers developing the application, but also your testing/developer experience. We need to create your test cases or run your test cases. You're not going to be happy, and we all know like a happy. If you're happy at your work, then that already like saves a lot of frustration, I think. Well, when you're happy, you're not frustrated. No, that's true. Having said that, research showed that if you would look at the total cost of ownership for mobile devices on-prem, then even though you have your hardware cost here, the total costs are 2 to 5 times higher. And also, when you get back to this, you would see that an on-prem grid is really awesome. Oh, sorry, too fast. But if you would then compare that, for example, with a cloud-based, then try to scale. If you now need to add multiple teams to use your on-prem grid, oh, then you need to buy more device. Oh, you need to think about your hardware. Oh, do I need to buy a new Mac Mini? Oh, I don't have enough power hubs. So there are some steps that will limit you in scaling. It's not that you can add more and remove it and add more and remove it. If you move to the cloud, you would have all those checks already in place. That also brings me back to this step. I'm like, if you think about the environment, how will this help you reduce cost and release faster? Well, we've already seen that when you look at your local machine, well, you're not able to scale. It will be a very costly thing if you would then build your on-prem grid. If you're able to implement this in multiple phases in your software development lifecycle, you're able to release this also faster. One webinar, and I didn't share a link on this slide, but I know I shared it on I will share it on one of the last slides, is that Diego Molina, staff product software engineer, also of the open source team working on Selenium, but also part of our community. He gave a presentation, a webinar a few months ago about Selenium grids, build versus buy. I would also advise you, if you've never built it yourself, try to look at it. It's really interesting to see how to spin this up. One of the outcomes, I'm going to already tell it to you, one of the outcomes will be that based on the research, when people start building it, in the end, they walk or they hit the iceberg, not the top, but they hit the bottom part. And in the end, they will buy a cloud solution. Having said that, let's now take a look at the coverage. We've referred already to the coverage in the strategy that you need to think about which configuration, OS versions, brands, models you need to use. We're going to cover now also that part here. Also what I've mentioned in when we needed to select the devices for the bank that we were working for. One thing that I wanted to mention here, which devices do you need to test? Do not reinvent the wheel. The data should, I will not say is, the data should already be there. And you might now wonder, data should already be there. What do you mean with that? Well, first of all, we need to understand who our target persona is. If we think about our application, what were the thoughts behind developing this application? Who is this application for? Who needs to use it? So what can help me determine which device? Because if I know my persona, I also know basically, I would expect like that I know the age of my end user. I would know if they're more fond of Android or iOS, all that kind of data. So the part that could help you within your organization would already be the marketing department, because they know how to put your product or the product that you're developing, how to put that on the market. They know who would buy your product or who would use your product. So the marketing department, 9 out of 10 times, would already have a persona on paper that could help you determine which OS would be more important, or which devices have been researched in a research that marketing did, which devices were being used. So that could already help you. The second data point is that if you already developed, or if your organization already developed other products, then hopefully they also added some traceability there, that you would have the option to get more data on that specific website, who is using it, which phones. Maybe you already have a drill down on ages of people. Most people use Google Analytics. You would have that data somewhere in your system. But you could also use this. But what if you're in a situation that you develop a completely new app? You don't know your persona. Marketing cannot help you. What should you do then? Well, you can think about using external data. And I know this will never be as accurate as you would use your internal data, but you could use, for example, open source data, which is the stat counter. It can give you more information about the market share, the OS market share, or the version market share. You should be able to drill down into brands, which brands are used the most. It could all help you to determine which brands, devices, models, OS versions you need to use. Ashwini, who you met at the beginning, also wrote a good blog post also about how to choose your mobile device in 2023. We will also share that link afterwards. It might also be some information that could help you select a device. It's not a silver bullet. You still need to look into certain things. Why? Let me show you that. If you, for example, look into the market share of Android and iOS, then you would see the geographical differences for the worldwide part, where you would see that Android is almost 3 times as big as iOS. But if you would drill down into the Asian market, then you would see it will be around 75% and 25% for iOS. If you look at Europe, then iOS will be around 35% and 65% for Android. And if you look at North America, that's the part where iOS wins from Android. And even if you drill down into the states, you would see that different states have different flavors. So don't use this data right away as the worldwide. So my customers will also do that unless you're operating worldwide. If you're not operating worldwide, dive a little bit deeper into the data. It will give you some good understanding about what you should use, which versions you can use or should use. So that could be really useful. So if you have that data, then you still need to select which devices. So how should you do it? I normally call this build your own profile. Based on that data, I would say that you need to start. This is just for startup. I'm not talking about if you're an enterprise org with 500 or 5,000 employees. This is basically just how I would start from the basics. I would go for a 5+1 device for Android. Why 5+1? First of all, if you would look into Android, there's a huge difference there between the used versions, the adoption rate of the versions. You need to think about supporting multiple versions. That's one of the goals you need to think about, that you need to be able to replicate certain situations on OS versions. So that's why I'm saying at least a 5+1. The +1 comes to a beta. It's always wise to look into what's happening with your application in a beta version. So in this case, we need to use a Pixel device. That is something that I would advise you. And then in case for Android, what we see that's being used the most worldwide, but also in different countries or areas, is that Samsung is basically just the biggest on the Android part. So maybe use a few Samsung devices and then look into low end and also a high end, because your users will also use different devices. For iOS, it's a little bit easier. You can use 4 devices, a 3+1. Also look into the high end and the low end. 2 major OS versions, because the adoption rate for iOS is way faster and bigger than with Android, and also 1 for a beta. I haven't included iPads or tablets here. This is kind of like a thing that you need to think about, kind of like a business risk if you want to address this yes or no. But looking at also iPads, this might be something a risk that you can take, but also, and this is something that we will cover in the next step, if you would add analytics to your application, you're able to collect that market share, to collect also the version and also brand and model. If you then figure out that you are missing an iPad, then just do this, learn and adjust while you're in production, collect your data, adjust your strategy and repeat. Do this all the time. And the reason why I'm saying this is that based on the data that we have, also from all the test cases that are being run by our customers, is that we see that some customers are still testing on, for example, 15.0. And there's already kind of like 15.5 out there. Why are we testing on 15.0? That's not what your end user is using. Maybe you should test on the versions that your end users are using just to catch the bugs, to be ahead of what's happening. You've seen that in one of the slides before. If I need to go to production with my application, I need to give it to the stores and I need to wait 1 to 7 days. I got that review time. So make sure that you're testing also on the right OS versions. Coverage. So how will this help reduce the cost and release faster? Well, I first want to go back to that strategy. This is basically the strategy. This is kind of like thinking about what should I test? This is your highway that you're going to create. Then you need to think about your environment, about, okay, where am I going to execute this? And then getting the right coverage based on the signals you would get, that would definitely help you release your application faster, because you can reduce your costs. You can focus on the things that you really need to test and even move certain steps in your testing space to the left or to the right to get the right data. So now that we covered this, how can Sauce Labs help you with this? How are we able to help you with these challenges? And for people who've never met Sauce Labs, or this is the first time that you're listening to someone from Sauce Labs, the things that we do from a Sauce Labs perspective is that we basically we are a platform for test. And at the bottom, kind of like the gray part, I would see that as our foundation. You can trust on it that we have the expertise, that we can help you with the strategy, that we also provide you the developer tools to debug certain things. We've got also our support department helping you with the challenges, and also the security and compliance certificates, because sometimes if you need to use a cloud solution, you also have some rules from your company, your security level. On top of that, we call ourselves kind of like the infrastructure part. This is basically the part where you are running your test cases on. But we're not only infrastructure, we're not orchestrating your test cases. We also can help you by providing different applications for visual testing, for example, for API, for live testing. You've got basically your complete environment. And then on top of that, you would have the observability, thinking about all the data that we have in Sauce Lab. We can provide you with, for example, the right insights, failure analysis, but also when you add those applications on top of it, we can also help you with some diagnostics about your application, crash and error and test reporting. So basically we see ourselves here as the platform for tests. And if you do this, then everything comes back and tries to help you make the right decisions. For example, thinking about your test strategy. Do you need to do everything manually, or do you want to transition from manual to automation? Which framework you want to use? Everything that you want to do can be supported also by Sauce Labs. So let's go back to the software development lifecycle. How would Sauce Labs fit in that software development lifecycle? This is a new image. I thought this is a little bit easier than the previous image I had from the software development lifecycle. But here you would see like, how can we help with the product, for example, that we deliver, or the extra functionality? How can we help you with building your app, with testing your app, with debugging, giving you the power to debug, for example, what is happening inside of your application, providing you the right error reporting, getting the data out from production, what is happening on that specific phone of your end user. Those are the things that we can help you with during your software development lifecycle. Because if you have the data, you know what to fix, you can fix it, build it, test it, debug, and deploy it again. We can help you in this cycle. And then just getting back to also the question, how can we reduce the cost? We did a research together with Forrester, and we will also share this report afterwards with you. If you just take a look at the numbers, the total economic impact, you would see that the ROI is 217% after 3 years, like a payback time lower than 6 months. But what's also important, thinking about that strategy, thinking about how you could help even your colleagues, your infrastructure savings will go down. They're like numbers that also the procurement department would love. But how awesome would it be that you can release your application with less bugs, that you have the possibility to test the things that you really need to test and reduce the amount of bugs that you release to production, or making your developers happier because they don't have that device on their desk. They have it in the cloud and they can use on that specific configuration. This will help you reduce your cost and also release faster to production. Like I mentioned also during the complete webinar, there are some useful links. I believe at least there are some useful links that you could reuse during your daily job. We will share this afterwards. I advise you to look at it, to scroll through it, to scan it. It could be really useful for your daily job. We're at the end of the presentation, so I hope there are some questions. I hope you also enjoyed it. And yeah, Ashwini, let's see if we have some questions.
Absolutely, Wim. Thank you for that excellent presentation. We do have some questions. So I see one question coming in from Victor. How would you use the pyramid when there are external factors on the app, for example, say a Bluetooth?
That's a really, really good question. It's kind of like the IoT of things. And we've been thinking about testing Bluetooth. How can you do that, for example, in the cloud? But that is really, really hard to do. One thing that I would always do, and this is like the hardest thing, because it goes against, it's a little bit, if you think about the cloud, you want to cover as many situations as you can. But in a cloud, we're not able to do that. What I always did is I always had one or two devices. I'm maybe a mobile nerd. I have a few devices at home. If I need to test those specific things, and if I need to test Bluetooth, then those are the scenarios, those non-functional scenarios that I would still do on a physical device. This is really hard to test in an automated way, because if you need to connect to a different device, or if you need to connect to your speaker, your Sonos speaker or your Bose speaker, for example, you also need to be able to reset that connection. So with automation, you don't always have the possibility to reset your speaker or to reset it. So those are the things that I would still do manually. And then, yes, it would be something that I would do on my own phone. Sorry. I hope that answers your question.
Great. We have one more from Augustine, who asks, how can I ensure compatibility and perform comprehensive testing across various devices, considering potential issues with specific models like the Red Xiaomi 11? Do we need to have a lot of Android devices?
I think that's a really good question. It all depends on the amount of issues that you have. Like I mentioned at the beginning, it's good to look into the reviews. If you get all the reviews back from production, from if you use beta testing, or if you have the right insights, it will tell you where the pitfalls are. What we already know with those devices is that, for example, CPU, memory, it's not the best. It's really hard to build an application that can work on every device flawlessly. We've seen this also when we had those devices in our cloud. If you then need to think about how can I cover this, what would be the best thing to do? First of all, I would make sure that you have the right diagnostics or analytics inside of your app, that you are able, that if something is happening on that specific device in production, that you know, for example, the steps, that you will get a crash report, and that crash report, if a bug happens or a crash happens, that crash report would tell you, okay, it's happening in this line of the code, and it's happening on this and this device. Acting on every crash is not possible, because your app will have external/internal crashes. Collecting that feedback will help you and your developers determine if you or need to add that device to your testing coverage, or if this is something that you need to collect, create a fingerprint for it, for example, and then track that fingerprint, and in the end use that and the data that you collect to also fix this together with the developer. I think covering this with a huge coverage of Android devices might still not catch that specific error that you're having on that specific device. So add the right traceability/observability.
Yeah, I see a lot more questions coming in, Wim, but I know we are almost at time. We might take just one more question here. George asks, how to test mobile biometrics?
That's a really good question. And I'm going to tell you a secret. Kind of like if you would now use biometrics in a cloud, doesn't matter which cloud vendor we're talking about. If we're talking about Sauce Lab specifically, then what we need to do to make this work is we need to inject something in the application itself. So what we can do is we can help you go from screen A to C by using biometrics, but the integration itself is secure. We cannot give you a device with an actual fingerprint and actual Face ID on it to test it. In this case, you need to believe that the complete architecture of your vendor will be Android or it will be iOS is based on APIs. It will check if there's biometrics enabled, yes or no. It will check if it can send a signal like a false and a positive. That is also something that we as cloud vendors can help you with. We can help you in your application test that. What will happen in a situation where the biometrics is accepted? What will happen in a situation where it's not accepted? Testing biometrics itself is not something that you can do in a cloud. That is something, if you really need to do this, if you really want to test it on the level of the OS, then you need to use a physical device. But then again, if that would be broken, if that system level for biometrics would be broken, then it's broken on Android or on iOS and broken for all the customers. So again, think about why should I test it and where should I test it, and then which signals should I basically think about that will help me go from screen A to screen Z.
Okay, great. I think that's all the time we have for today's webinar. Thank you, Wim, for all your insightful, comments and discussions here. And thank you, everyone, for attending and your enthusiastic participation. On behalf of Sauce Labs, thank you for joining us and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.